Hi, I'm Natalie Brennan. A 76-year-old decorated war hero stood in a coat closet because my stepmother said veterans make donors uncomfortable. When I called her out, she had security drag me through the lobby while 100 people in tuxedos pretended not to see. 30 minutes later, his convoy rolled up with enough brass to make a general salute, and what happened next got picked up by every military news outlet from here to Okinawa. Want to know who actually funded that whole event? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I showed up to the Veterans Vela Gala wearing a navy dress I found at a consignment shop in Charlotte, the kind with 3/4 sleeves and a hem that hit just below the knee. Simple. Respectful. The October air in Asheville had that mountain chill to it, sharp enough to make you pull your cardigan tighter as you walked from the parking garage to the Fort Harrison Memorial Hotel. The building itself looked like something out of an old postcard, all red brick and white columns, with American flags hanging from the upper balconies and golden light spilling out of every tall window. Inside the lobby, everything gleamed. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my yearly salary as a middle school history teacher. Waiters in crisp white jackets carried trays of champagne in flutes so delicate they looked like they might shatter if you breathed on them too hard. Women floated past in gowns that whispered when they moved, sequins catching the light, diamonds at their throats and wrists. Men stood in clusters wearing tuxedos that fit like they'd been sewn directly onto their bodies, talking in low voices about portfolios and board meetings and vacation homes in places I'd only seen in travel magazines. I felt the weight of every single glance that slid over me and kept moving. Not hostile, just indifferent. The kind of look you give someone who's wandered into the wrong room. I smoothed down the front of my dress and reminded myself why I'd driven 2 hours to be here. This gala raised funds for wounded veterans. It honored people who'd sacrificed everything. That mattered more than whether my shoes came from a department store clearance rack. My stepmother Veronica spotted me before I'd made it halfway across the lobby. She moved toward me with the kind of precision that comes from years of country club luncheons and charity board meetings. Her rose-colored gown fitted so perfectly it might as well have been painted on. Her hair was swept up in some complicated twist that probably required an appointment and a credit card I didn't own. Her smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes. She stopped in front of me and let her gaze travel from my shoes up to my face, slow and deliberate, like she was conducting an inspection. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet enough that nobody else would hear but loud enough for me to catch every word. You came. It wasn't a greeting. It was an observation, tinged with surprise and something that might have been disappointment. I nodded and tried to return her smile, though mine probably looked as strained as it felt. Of course. It's important. She made a small noise in the back of her throat, something between acknowledgement and dismissal, then turned slightly to gesture toward the grand ballroom where the event would be held. The doors were open, and I could see round tables draped in white linens, centerpieces made of red and white roses around miniature American flags, place settings that looked like they belonged in a museum. Try not to draw attention to yourself, she said, already turning away. And for heaven's sake, don't mention that you're related to us. She walked off before I could respond, her heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that sounded almost musical. I stood there for a moment, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever Veronica reminded me exactly where I ranked in her world. My father had married her 6 years after my mother died, and in the decade since, she'd made it abundantly clear that I was a relic from his previous life, something to be tolerated at best and erased at worst. Trevor, my half-brother, was somewhere in the crowd. I caught a glimpse of him near the bar, laughing with a group of men in tailored suits, his hand wrapped around a rocks glass filled with something amber. He was 32, 3 years older than me, and he'd inherited Veronica's ability to navigate rooms like these as if he'd been born in them. Which, in a way, he had. He didn't look in my direction. He never did at events like this. I found my name on the seating chart near the entrance to the ballroom. Table 19. I scanned the room, counting rows. Table 1 was at the front, closest to the stage where the speakers would stand. Table 2 was just behind it. The numbers climbed as you moved toward the back. Table 19 was in the far corner, tucked behind a decorative column and partially blocked by the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. I could hear the clatter of dishes and the low murmur of catering staff preparing for service. The chair had my name written on a small card in elegant calligraphy. Natalie Brennan. I sat down and looked around. The other seats at my table were still empty. Most guests were still in the lobby, networking, sipping cocktails, taking photographs in front of the Step and Repeat banner covered in corporate sponsor logos. I sat there alone and watched the room fill up. Laughter echoed off the high ceiling. Camera flashes went off near the front where someone important must have arrived. A string quartet played softly in the corner, something classical that I recognized but couldn't name. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. That's when I saw him. The lobby doors opened, and Colonel Henry Garrett walked in slowly, carefully, like every step required thought. He was 76 years old, a man who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam and spent the last 40 years running a foundation that provided housing and support for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. He wore his dress uniform, the deep blue fabric still crisp despite his age, ribbons and medals pinned across his chest in neat rows. A purple heart. A bronze star. Others I didn't recognize but knew represented acts of courage I couldn't begin to imagine. His shoulders were slightly stooped now, his hands marked with age spots and the faint tremor that comes with time. But his eyes were sharp, clear, taking in the room with the kind of awareness that never fully leaves someone who's spent years in combat. He moved with the help of a cane, black and simple, the rubber tip making soft tapping sounds against the marble. I stood up without thinking, my chair scraping against the floor. I'd never met Colonel Garrett in person, but I knew who he was. Everyone in this room should have known who he was. He'd been featured in documentaries. His foundation had saved lives. He'd lost his only daughter, Lieutenant Grace Garrett, in Afghanistan 12 years ago. She'd been 28. A medic. Killed by an IED while trying to reach wounded soldiers under fire. He'd turned his grief into something that mattered. The Garrett Foundation had built housing for homeless veterans, funded PTSD treatment programs, provided job training and placement services. It was the kind of legacy that deserved more than a passing mention at events like this. It deserved the front table. It deserved a standing ovation. I started walking toward him, weaving between tables, but someone else reached him first. Marcus Webb, the hotel's event coordinator, approached with a clipboard and a smile that looked rehearsed. I slowed down, close enough to hear but not close enough to interrupt. "Colonel Garrett, welcome. We're so honored to have you here tonight." The colonel nodded, his expression neutral but polite. "Thank you for the invitation." Marcus glanced down at his clipboard, flipping through pages. "Let me show you to your seat. We have you right over here." He gestured toward the back of the room. Not table 19 where I was sitting, but somewhere even farther. I followed at a distance, curious, my stomach starting to tighten with something that felt like dread. Marcus led the colonel past the main seating area, past the decorative columns, past the kitchen doors. He stopped at a narrow hallway that connected the ballroom to the service areas. There was a small folding table set up there, the kind you'd see at a church basement potluck, with a single folding chair. The table was wedged between a coat closet and a utility door marked staff only. The wallpaper was faded in this section, the lighting dim compared to the rest of the room. "Here we are," Marcus said brightly, pulling out the chair. Colonel Garrett stared at the setup for a long moment. He didn't sit down. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, gripping his cane, looking at the folding chair and the dark hallway and the coat closet door. I felt something hot and sharp rise in my chest. This wasn't right. This wasn't an oversight. This was deliberate. I walked over quickly, my heels clicking louder than I intended. "Excuse me." Marcus turned, his smile faltering slightly when he saw me. "Can I help you? Why is Colonel Garrett seated here?" Marcus blinked, his expression shifting into something practiced and smooth. "This is his assigned seat. All the seating arrangements were finalized weeks ago." I looked at the folding table, then back at Marcus. "He's a decorated veteran. He runs the Garrett Foundation. Why isn't he at one of the front tables?" Marcus's smile tightened. I don't handle seating assignments. You'd have to take that up with the event committee. The event committee. Which meant Veronica. She was the co-chair this year, along with 2 other women from her social circle. I felt my jaw clench. This is unacceptable. Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. We're about to begin. Colonel Garrett finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. It's all right. I don't need any fuss. I turned to him, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that made my throat tighten. Resignation. The kind that comes from being dismissed so many times you stop expecting anything different. No, I said, louder than I meant to. It's not all right. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. Miss Brennan, please. You're causing a scene. Good. Maybe someone should. I turned away from him and walked straight toward the front of the room where Veronica stood near the stage, talking with a woman in a silver gown and a man who looked like he belonged in a boardroom. I didn't care that people were starting to notice. I didn't care that heads were turning.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I reached Veronica and waited for a break in her conversation. When she finally glanced at me, her expression shifted into something cold and annoyed. Natalie, what are you doing? Why is Colonel Garrett seated in a hallway next to a coat closet? Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she took a small step away from her companions, guiding me to the side with a hand on my elbow that looked gentle but felt like a warning. Lower your voice, she hissed. Answer the question. Veronica glanced around, making sure no one was close enough to hear. The seating arrangements were carefully planned. We have major donors at the front tables. People who contribute significant funds. He runs a foundation for veterans. This whole event is supposed to honor people like him. She let out a small, impatient sigh. Natalie, you don't understand how these things work. Optics matter. We can't have someone who looks like that sitting front and center when we're trying to attract high-net-worth individuals. Someone who looks like what? She didn't answer, but her meaning was clear. Too old. Too frail. Too much of a reminder of the uncomfortable realities that people at events like this preferred to keep at arm's length. I felt something inside me shift, harden. He's a war hero. He's also not a donor, she said flatly. And donors don't want to spend an evening staring at someone who makes them feel guilty. I stared at her. For a moment, I couldn't find words. When I finally spoke, my voice was shaking. You're serious. Completely. Now go back to your seat before you embarrass yourself further. She turned to walk away. I reached out and grabbed her arm, not hard, just enough to stop her. She spun back, her eyes flashing with anger. Let go of me. Move him to a front table. Absolutely not. Then I'm going to stand up during the program and tell everyone exactly why he's sitting in a hallway. Her expression went ice cold. You wouldn't dare. Try me. For a moment, we just stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then Veronica's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. She pulled her arm free and smoothed down the fabric of her gown. Security, she called, her voice calm and clear. 2 men in dark suits appeared almost instantly. They must have been stationed nearby, waiting. Veronica gestured toward me with one manicured hand. Please escort Miss Brennan out of the building. She's disrupting the event. I felt my stomach drop. What? One of the security guards stepped closer, his expression neutral but firm. We need you to come with us. I looked around. People were watching now, dozens of faces turned in our direction. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable. No one said anything. No one stepped forward. You can't be serious, I said, looking at Veronica. She met my gaze without flinching. You made your choice. The security guards moved in, one on each side of me. I pulled away, but their grips tightened. Not painful, but unyielding. I can walk myself out, I said. They didn't let go. They guided me through the crowd, past the tables, past the people in their expensive clothes who turned away as we passed, suddenly very interested in their champagne or their programs. My face burned. My heart hammered against my ribs. We crossed the lobby, my heels echoing against the marble, and they pushed through the main doors out into the cold October air. They released me on the front steps. One of them spoke, his tone flat and professional. "You need to leave the property." I stood there, shaking, not from the cold but from rage and humiliation. Through the glass doors, I could see the gala continuing as if nothing had happened. The lights, the laughter, the champagne. Inside that building, a war hero sat in a hallway next to a coat closet because he didn't fit the aesthetic. I turned and walked down the steps, my legs unsteady. I made it to the edge of the parking garage before I had to stop and lean against a concrete pillar. I pressed my forehead against the cold stone and closed my eyes, trying to breathe, trying to think. That's when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, startled. Colonel Garrett stood there, leaning on his cane, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" "I should be asking you that," I said, my voice thick. He shook his head slowly. "I've seen worse. But you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." He studied me for a moment, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. He pressed it into my hand before I could see what it was. His fingers were warm despite the cold air. "Hold on to this," he said quietly. "You might need it." I looked down. It was a replica of a Purple Heart medal, small and delicate, hanging from a silver chain. The kind of thing you'd give to family, to someone who mattered. "I don't understand." "You will," he said. Then he turned and walked slowly back toward the hotel entrance, his cane tapping against the pavement. I watched him disappear inside, swallowed by the golden light and the crowd of people who'd already forgotten he existed. I stood there in the cold, holding the medal, feeling its weight in my palm. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know why he'd given it to me. But I held on to it like he'd told me to, my fingers wrapping around the metal until it warmed against my skin. And I waited. 20 minutes passed while I stood there in the parking garage, the medal clutched in my fist, my breath forming small clouds in the autumn air. The concrete walls around me blocked most of the wind, but I could still feel the chill seeping through my cardigan. Inside the hotel, the gala had started. I could hear the muffled sound of a microphone, someone speaking, applause rising and falling like waves. I should have left. I should have gotten in my car and driven the 2 hours back to Charlotte, back to my small apartment with the radiator that clanked and the neighbor's dog that barked at 3 in the morning. I should have accepted what had happened and moved on, the way I'd learned to do with every other disappointment Veronica had served me over the years. But something kept me there. Maybe it was the weight of the medal in my hand. Maybe it was the look in Colonel Garrett's eyes when he'd stood in that hallway staring at a folding chair. Maybe it was just exhaustion from years of staying quiet, of smoothing things over, of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I heard the sound before I saw anything. A deep rumble, the kind that makes your chest vibrate even from a distance. Not the purr of expensive sedans or the hum of hotel shuttles. This was something else entirely. Heavy. Purposeful. Moving with the kind of confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. I turned toward the entrance of the parking garage. 3 black SUVs rolled in slowly, their headlights cutting through the dim fluorescent glow. They weren't speeding. They weren't rushing. They moved in perfect formation, one after the other, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. The first vehicle stopped near the hotel entrance, and the door opened. A man stepped out wearing marine dress blues, his posture so straight it looked like someone had run a steel rod through his spine. He was maybe 40, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples and the kind of face that had seen things most people only read about in history books. He scanned the area with quick, efficient movements, his gaze passing over me without pause, then moved to open the rear passenger door. Colonel Garrett emerged from the back seat. But he wasn't the same man I'd seen limping through the lobby an hour ago. He still had the cane, still had the lined face and spotted hands, but something fundamental had shifted. He stood taller. His uniform looked sharper, like someone had pressed every crease to razor precision. And his eyes, those clear, sharp eyes, held something I hadn't seen before. Authority. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. Behind him, more people exited the other vehicles. 2 women in army dress uniforms, both wearing ranks I recognized from teaching history. A major and a captain. 3 more men, all in different service dress, all carrying themselves with that same unmistakable bearing. These weren't people who'd come to attend a gala. These were people who'd come to make a point. The Marine who'd opened the door for Colonel Garrett spoke quietly into a radio clipped to his shoulder. Then he looked directly at me. His expression didn't change, but he gave a small nod, just enough to acknowledge my presence. Colonel Garrett saw me and walked over, his cane tapping against the pavement with steady rhythm. The group behind him followed at a respectful distance, forming a loose perimeter that somehow managed to be both protective and unobtrusive. "Miss Brennan," he said when he reached me. His voice was different now. Stronger. Less of the gentle rasp I'd heard before. "You're still here." I didn't know where else to go, I admitted, still holding the medal. He glanced down at my closed fist, and something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "Good. You're going to want to see this." "See what?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to the Marine beside him. "Sergeant Ortega, is everything ready?" "Yes, sir. They're expecting us." "Who's expecting you?" I asked, confused. Colonel Garrett looked back at the hotel, its golden windows glowing against the darkening sky. "Everyone who needs to." He started walking toward the entrance, and I found myself following without quite deciding to. The group moved with us, maintaining that same protective formation. As we approached the main doors, I saw the 2 security guards who'd escorted me out earlier. They stood near the entrance, and their expressions shifted from bored professionalism to something approaching alarm when they saw our group approaching. One of them stepped forward, raising a hand. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to wait here while I confirm with event management." Sergeant Ortega moved smoothly between the guard and Colonel Garrett. "That won't be necessary." The guard's confidence wavered. He looked at the uniforms, the ranks, the sheer presence of the people standing in front of him. His partner reached for his radio, but before he could speak into it, the hotel's front doors opened from the inside. Marcus Webb emerged, his clipboard still in hand, his expression cycling rapidly through confusion, concern, and something that looked like panic. He took in the scene, the vehicles, the uniforms, the colonel standing there like a general about to address his troops. "Colonel Garrett," Marcus said, his voice pitching slightly higher than normal. "Is there a problem? If you need assistance finding your seat, I can have someone escort you." "I won't be needing that seat," the colonel said evenly. "I'll be addressing the event from the main stage." Marcus blinked rapidly. "I'm sorry, that's not possible. The program is already set. All the speakers have been confirmed for weeks. Then you'll need to make an adjustment." "Sir, I don't have the authority to change the program. You'd need to speak with the event committee." The colonel tilted his head slightly. "Then get them." Marcus hesitated, his fingers tightening around his clipboard. He looked at the uniformed service members standing behind the colonel, clearly doing calculations in his head about how badly this could go if he refused. Finally, he nodded and pulled out his phone, stepping away to make a call. We stood there in the cool evening air, the sounds of the gala drifting out through the open doors. I could hear music now, something orchestral and patriotic. Inside, people were probably eating their salads, sipping wine, listening to speeches about sacrifice and service from people who'd never worn a uniform. Colonel Garrett turned to me. "You did a brave thing tonight." "I got thrown out," I said, my voice flat. "You stood up. That's more than most people in that room will ever do." I looked down at the medal still pressed into my palm. "Why did you give this to me?" He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened just slightly. "My daughter wore one like that. Not the real one went with her when we buried her. But she had a replica on a chain, kept it in her locker during deployment. Said it reminded her why she was there." "Lieutenant Grace Garrett," I said quietly. "I'd read about her. Seen her picture in articles about the foundation." He nodded. "You remind me of her. Not in looks, but in something else. That refusal to look away when something's wrong." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. We stood together in silence until Marcus returned, his face pale and pinched. "The committee would like to speak with you inside," he said to Colonel Garrett. "Privately." No, the colonel said simply. Anything they have to say, they can say in front of everyone. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He stepped aside, holding the door open. Colonel Garrett walked through, and I followed, and behind us came the entire uniformed group, our footsteps echoing against the marble lobby floor. People turned to stare as we passed. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman holding a champagne flute froze with the glass halfway to her lips. We moved through the lobby like a procession, steady and unhurried, and the crowd parted without anyone having to ask them to move. The ballroom doors were closed, but we could hear the speaker inside, a man's voice droning on about commitment to veterans and community responsibility. Colonel Garrett reached the doors and pushed them open. The voice cut off mid-word. Every head in the room turned toward us. The speaker on stage, a silver-haired man in a tuxedo who I vaguely recognized as some local politician, stood frozen at the podium. Veronica sat at table 1, her face going through a rapid series of expressions I'd never seen on her before. Shock. Confusion. And then, as her eyes landed on the uniforms and ranks surrounding the colonel, something that looked distinctly like fear. Trevor was at table 3, his rocks glass suspended halfway to his mouth. My father sat beside Veronica, his expression carefully blank the way it always was when he didn't want to deal with conflict. Colonel Garrett walked down the center aisle between the tables, his cane tapping rhythmically against the floor. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound was our footsteps and the faint rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats to watch us pass. We reached the front of the room. The politician at the podium stepped back instinctively, making space. Colonel Garrett mounted the 3 steps to the stage slowly but without assistance. Sergeant Ortega moved to follow, but the colonel waved him off. When he reached the podium, he adjusted the microphone down to his height and looked out at the crowd. "Good evening," he said, his voice filling the room with a clarity that made the earlier speaker sound thin and reedy by comparison. "For those who don't know me, my name is Henry Garrett. Colonel, United States Army, retired." There were scattered murmurs through the crowd. Some people clearly recognized the name. Others were still trying to figure out what was happening. "I was invited to this event tonight," the colonel continued. "Told it was a gathering to honor veterans and raise funds for those who served. I flew in from San Diego because I believed that was true. When I arrived, I was shown to a seat in a service hallway, tucked between a coat closet and a utility door, well out of sight of the main gathering." More murmurs now, louder. People were looking at each other, at the event organizers, at Veronica. When a young woman questioned this arrangement, she was physically removed from the building by security. "That young woman is standing right there." He pointed toward me. Every eye in the room followed his gesture. I felt my face flush hot, but I kept my chin up and met their stares without flinching. "Her name is Natalie Brennan," the colonel said. "She's a middle school history teacher from Charlotte. She drove 2 hours to be here tonight. She wore a dress she could afford and sat where she was told to sit. And when she saw something wrong, she spoke up. For that, she was humiliated and ejected." Veronica stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Colonel Garrett, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We can discuss this privately." "Sit down," the colonel said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't harsh. But the command in those 2 words was absolute. "Veronica Saturday. There's no misunderstanding," he continued. "I know exactly what happened. I've seen it happen before. I've watched veterans be sidelined, hidden away, treated like inconvenient reminders of uncomfortable truths. Usually, I let it slide. Life's too short to fight every battle. But tonight was different." He paused, letting the silence stretch. The room was so quiet I could hear the heating vents humming. "Tonight, someone fought that battle for me. Someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose stood up anyway. That kind of courage is rare. And it deserves to be acknowledged, not punished." "What are you suggesting?" Veronica's voice was sharp, but there was a tremor underneath it. "I'm not suggesting anything," the colonel said. "I'm telling you how things are going to be. This event, this hotel, this entire foundation, exists because of funding from the Garrett Foundation. My foundation. Every year, we provide grants totaling $750,000 to organizations that claim to support veterans. This gala is one of those organizations. The room erupted in whispers. I saw people pulling out phones, probably looking up the Garrett Foundation, confirming what he was saying. Veronica's face had gone from pale to ashen. I built that foundation 40 years ago with money I earned in the private sector after leaving the service. I built it in memory of men and women I served with who came home to nothing. And 12 years ago, I expanded it in memory of my daughter, Lieutenant Grace Garrett, who died serving this country. His voice didn't waver. He stated these facts like they were mission parameters, clear and unemotional. But I could see his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the podium. This foundation has one purpose: to ensure that veterans are treated with the dignity and respect they earned. Tonight, I saw the opposite. I saw donors prioritized over the people we're supposed to be serving. I saw optics valued more than honor. And I saw someone punished for demanding better. He turned his gaze to Veronica. Mrs. Brennan, your committee will not be receiving funding from the Garrett Foundation this year or any year going forward. Furthermore, I'm withdrawing our existing grant, effective immediately. Veronica shot to her feet again. You can't do that. We have contracts. Obligations. Read the fine print of your grant agreement, the colonel said. Funds can be withdrawn at any time if the foundation determines they're not being used in accordance with our mission. I've made that determination. Trevor was on his feet now too, his face flushed. This is insane. You're destroying months of work over a seating arrangement. Over a choice, the colonel corrected. A choice to hide a veteran in a hallway because his presence might make wealthy donors uncomfortable. A choice to silence someone who called out that injustice. Those aren't small things, son. Those are the things that define who you are. He looked back out at the crowd. To everyone here tonight who came genuinely wanting to support veterans, I apologize that your evening has been disrupted. But I won't apologize for speaking truth. If you'd like to continue supporting worthy causes, I'd invite you to look into organizations that actually practice what they preach. Then he turned away from the podium and walked slowly off the stage. Sergeant Ortega met him at the bottom of the steps, and together they moved back up the center aisle. The uniformed service members fell into formation around them. As the colonel passed my father's table, he stopped. My father looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. The colonel didn't say anything. He just shook his head slightly, disappointment written clearly on his face, and kept walking. When he reached me, he paused. Ready to go? I nodded, still too stunned to form words. We walked together out of the ballroom, through the lobby, and back into the cold October night. Behind us, the room had erupted into chaos. Voices raised in argument, phones ringing, people shouting for Marcus or other event staff. But we kept walking until we were back in the parking garage, back where this had started. The colonel stopped beside the lead SUV and turned to face me. Sergeant Ortega opened the door but stayed at a respectful distance. You've got fire in you, the colonel said. Don't let people like that put it out. I finally found my voice. What happens now? He smiled, tired but genuine. Now you go home. Get some sleep. And tomorrow, you'll probably see your name in some news stories. Military news outlets love this kind of thing. I felt my stomach drop. News stories? You stood up to entitled wealth on behalf of a veteran. You got thrown out for it. And then that veteran turned out to control their funding. It's the kind of story that gets shared on every base from here to Okinawa. I pressed my hand to my forehead, feeling dizzy. I didn't do this for attention. I know, he said gently. That's why it matters. That's why people will care. He reached into the vehicle and pulled out a folder, thick with documents. He held it out to me. What is this? Information about the Garrett Foundation. What we do, how we do it, who we help. There's also a letter of recommendation in there, if you ever decide you want to do more than teach history. We always need people who understand what service actually means. I took the folder, feeling its weight. Colonel, I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything. Just keep being who you are. Keep standing up when something's wrong. That's enough. He climbed into the SUV with Sergeant Ortega's assistance. Before the door closed, he looked at me one more time. Keep the medal, he said. You earned it. Then the door shut, and the convoy pulled away, 3 black SUVs disappearing into the night as smoothly as they'd arrived. I stood there in the parking garage, holding a folder and a Purple Heart replica, watching their taillights fade. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out and saw 17 missed calls. 10 from Veronica's number. 4 from Trevor. 3 from numbers I didn't recognize. There were texts too, dozens of them, but I didn't read them. Not yet. Instead, I walked to my car, a 10-year-old sedan with a dent in the passenger door and a check engine light that had been on for 3 months. I got in, placed the folder on the passenger seat, and hung the medal from my rearview mirror. It swung gently, catching the dim light. I sat there for a long moment, my hands on the steering wheel, trying to process everything that had just happened. Inside the hotel, the gala was falling apart. Outside, in the real world, a story was beginning that I hadn't asked for but somehow felt right. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking garage, leaving the Fort Harrison Memorial Hotel behind me. The road back to Charlotte was dark and winding, cutting through mountains that looked like shadows against the night sky. But I didn't mind the drive. I had 2 hours to think, to understand, to figure out what came next. The medal swayed with every turn, a small weight that somehow felt like a promise. That I'd done something that mattered. That standing up had been worth it. That maybe, just maybe, some fights were worth having even when you knew they'd cost you everything. I drove through the night, heading home, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I'd actually done something right. I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of my apartment and the sound of my phone vibrating so hard it had walked itself halfway across my nightstand. I reached for it groggily, squinting at the screen. 43 notifications. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails, and something I hadn't expected at all, tags on social media from accounts I didn't even follow. I sat up, my head still fuzzy with sleep, and opened the first message. It was from a former college roommate I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Just saw the video. Holy shit, National. You're everywhere. Video. What video? I opened my social media app with a sense of creeping dread and there it was, right at the top of my feed. Someone had recorded the entire confrontation at the gala. Not just snippets, the whole thing. Colonel Garrett walking into the ballroom with his uniformed entourage. His speech from the podium. Veronica's face draining of color. The announcement about pulling funding. Everything. The video had been posted by someone I didn't know, an account called Military Truth that had 500,000 followers. The caption read, "War hero humiliated at charity gala, then this happened. Teacher stands up for what's right and pays the price. Watch till the end." It had been viewed 2.3 million times. 2.3 million. In less than 12 hours. The comments section was a flood. Thousands of people weighing in, most of them furious on my behalf and the colonel's, some defending Veronica and the event organizers, others sharing their own stories of veterans being mistreated or ignored. I scrolled through them, my heart pounding, feeling like I was watching something happen to someone else. Another notification popped up. An email from a local news station requesting an interview. Then another from a military podcast. Then a message request on social media from someone claiming to be a producer for a national morning show. I set the phone down on my bed and pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to slow my breathing. This wasn't supposed to happen. I'd stood up because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted attention. Not because I wanted my face plastered across the internet with strangers debating whether I was a hero or a troublemaker or just naive. My phone rang, the actual call function this time, and I almost didn't answer. But the name on the screen made me hesitate. Dad. I hadn't heard from my father since the gala. Hadn't expected to, honestly. He'd perfected the art of staying neutral, of not taking sides, of letting Veronica make decisions and then quietly going along with them to keep the peace. I answered. "Hello. Natalie." His voice sounded strained, tired. "We need to talk. About what happened last night. About what you did last night." There was a pause, and I could hear him breathing. Veronica is beside herself. The foundation pulled their funding. The event lost over $300,000 in committed donations. People are asking for refunds. The hotel is threatening to sue for breach of contract because the gala ended early and violated their agreement. I waited for him to continue, but he seemed to be waiting for me to respond. When I didn't, he sighed. This is a disaster, Natalie. A disaster for who? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. For everyone. For the veterans who were supposed to benefit from that funding. For the organizations that rely on events like this. For your stepmother's reputation. And what about Colonel Garrett's reputation? What about treating a war hero like he was something to hide? That was a misunderstanding. A mistake in the seating arrangements. It wasn't a mistake, Dad. You were there. You heard what she said to me. Silence on the other end. Long enough that I thought he might have hung up. Then, quietly, she's my wife, Natalie. I have to support her. Even when she's wrong. It's not that simple. It actually is, I said. But you've never wanted to see that. I heard him take a breath like he was about to argue, then stop. More silence. Finally, Trevor wants to talk to you. He thinks you owe Veronica an apology. I almost laughed. Almost. I'm not apologizing. Natalie, please. Just think about what this is doing to the family. I am thinking about it. I'm thinking about how the family threw me out of an event for asking a question. I'm thinking about how nobody, not you, not Trevor, not one single person in that room stood up and said that what was happening was wrong. So no, Dad. I'm not apologizing. And if that's what you called to ask me to do, then we're done here. I hung up before he could respond. My hand was shaking. I set the phone down on the bed and stood up, pacing the small space of my bedroom. 8 steps from the window to the door. 8 steps back. My chest felt tight, my thoughts spinning. Another call came through. I ignored it. Then a text from a number I didn't recognize. Miss Brennan, this is Sergeant Felix Ortega. We met briefly last night. Colonel Garrett would like to speak with you when you have a moment. No pressure. Here's his direct number. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I saved the number and called it. He answered on the second ring. Natalie. I was hoping you'd call. Colonel Garrett. I just saw the video. It's everywhere. I know. My grandson showed me this morning. Kid's better with the internet than I'll ever be. He sounded amused rather than concerned. How are you holding up? I don't know, I admitted. People keep calling. News outlets. My family. Everyone wants something. That sounds about right. Want some advice from someone who's been through this sort of thing before? Please. Don't talk to anyone until you've figured out what you want to say. The media will twist whatever you give them into the story they've already decided to tell. Family will pressure you to choose sides. Neither of those things should dictate how you move forward. I sat down on the edge of my bed. What should I do then? Whatever feels true to you. If you want to give interviews, do it. If you want to stay quiet, that's fine too. But don't let anyone else make that decision for you. I thought about that. About all the times I'd let other people's expectations shape my choices. Veronica's disdain. My father's neutrality. Trevor's dismissal. Even my ex-boyfriend who told me I cared too much about things that didn't matter. I'd spent years trying to fit into spaces that didn't want me, trying to smooth over conflicts that weren't my fault. I think I want to stay quiet, I said finally. At least for now. Good instinct. Let the story run its course. It'll die down eventually. These things always do. He paused. But Natalie, there is something I'd like to discuss with you. Not for the media. Just between us. What is it? The folder I gave you last night. Did you look through it? I glanced at my dresser where I'd placed it when I got home. Not yet. I was too tired. Take a look when you get a chance. There's information in there about the foundation, what we do, how we operate. But there's also something else. A letter specifically for you. A letter. From me. An offer, actually. Not one you have to accept, and not one I need an answer on right away. But I think you should know it exists. My curiosity was immediate and overwhelming. Can you tell me what it's about? I'd rather you read it first. Give it some thought. Then call me back if you want to discuss it. His voice softened. You impressed me last night, Natalie. I reached for it groggily, squinting at the screen. 43 notifications. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails, and something I hadn't expected at all, tags on social media from accounts I didn't even follow. I sat up, my head still fuzzy with sleep, and opened the first message. It was from a former college roommate I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Just saw the video. Holy shit, National. You're everywhere. Video. What video? I opened my social media app with a sense of creeping dread, and there it was, right at the top of my feed. Someone had recorded the entire confrontation at the gala. Not just snippets, the whole thing. Colonel Garrett walking into the ballroom with his uniformed entourage. His speech from the podium. Veronica's face draining of color. The announcement about pulling funding. Everything. The video had been posted by someone I didn't know, an account called Military Truth that had 500,000 followers. The caption read, "War hero humiliated at charity gala, then this happened. Teacher stands up for what's right and pays the price. Watch till the end." It had been viewed 2.3 million times. 2.3 million. In less than 12 hours. The comments section was a flood. Thousands of people weighing in, most of them furious on my behalf and the colonel's, some defending Veronica and the event organizers, others sharing their own stories of veterans being mistreated or ignored. I scrolled through them, my heart pounding, feeling like I was watching something happen to someone else. Another notification popped up. An email from a local news station requesting an interview. Then another from a military podcast. Then a message request on social media from someone claiming to be a producer for a national morning show. I set the phone down on my bed and pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to slow my breathing. This wasn't supposed to happen. I'd stood up because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted attention. Not because I wanted my face plastered across the internet with strangers debating whether I was a hero or a troublemaker or just naive. My phone rang, the actual call function this time, and I almost didn't answer. But the name on the screen made me hesitate. Dad. I hadn't heard from my father since the gala. Hadn't expected to, honestly. He'd perfected the art of staying neutral, of not taking sides, of letting Veronica make decisions and then quietly going along with them to keep the peace. I answered. "Hello. Natalie." His voice sounded strained, tired. "We need to talk. About what happened last night. About what you did last night." There was a pause, and I could hear him breathing. Veronica is beside herself. The foundation pulled their funding. The event lost over $300,000 in committed donations. People are asking for refunds. The hotel is threatening to sue for breach of contract because the gala ended early and violated their agreement. I waited for him to continue, but he seemed to be waiting for me to respond. When I didn't, he sighed. "This is a disaster, Natalie." "A disaster for who?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "For everyone. For the veterans who were supposed to benefit from that funding. For the organizations that rely on events like this. For your stepmother's reputation. And what about Colonel Garrett's reputation? What about treating a war hero like he was something to hide? That was a misunderstanding. A mistake in the seating arrangements. It wasn't a mistake, Dad. You were there. You heard what she said to me. Silence on the other end. Long enough that I thought he might have hung up. Then, quietly, she's my wife, Natalie. I have to support her. Even when she's wrong. It's not that simple. It actually is, I said. But you've never wanted to see that. I heard him take a breath like he was about to argue, then stop. More silence. Finally, Trevor wants to talk to you. He thinks you owe Veronica an apology. I almost laughed. Almost. I'm not apologizing. Natalie, please. Just think about what this is doing to the family. I am thinking about it. I'm thinking about how the family threw me out of an event for asking a question. I'm thinking about how nobody, not you, not Trevor, not one single person in that room stood up and said that what was happening was wrong. So no, Dad. I'm not apologizing. And if that's what you called to ask me to do, then we're done here. I hung up before he could respond. My hand was shaking. I set the phone down on the bed and stood up, pacing the small space of my bedroom. 8 steps from the window to the door. 8 steps back. My chest felt tight, my thoughts spinning. Another call came through. I ignored it. Then a text from a number I didn't recognize. Miss Brennan, this is Sergeant Felix Ortega. We met briefly last night. Colonel Garrett would like to speak with you when you have a moment. No pressure. Here's his direct number. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I saved the number and called it. He answered on the second ring. Natalie. I was hoping you'd call. Colonel Garrett. I just saw the video. It's everywhere. I know. My grandson showed me this morning. Kid's better with the internet than I'll ever be. He sounded amused rather than concerned. How are you holding up? I don't know, I admitted. People keep calling. News outlets. My family. Everyone wants something. That sounds about right. Want some advice from someone who's been through this sort of thing before? Please. Don't talk to anyone until you've figured out what you want to say. The media will twist whatever you give them into the story they've already decided to tell. Family will pressure you to choose sides. Neither of those things should dictate how you move forward. I sat down on the edge of my bed. What should I do then? Whatever feels true to you. If you want to give interviews, do it. If you want to stay quiet, that's fine too. But don't let anyone else make that decision for you. I thought about that. About all the times I'd let other people's expectations shape my choices. Veronica's disdain. My father's neutrality. Trevor's dismissal. Even my ex-boyfriend who'd told me I cared too much about things that didn't matter. I'd spent years trying to fit into spaces that didn't want me, trying to smooth over conflicts that weren't my fault. I think I want to stay quiet, I said finally. At least for now. Good instinct. Let the story run its course. It'll die down eventually. These things always do. He paused. But Natalie, there is something I'd like to discuss with you. Not for the media. Just between us. What is it? The folder I gave you last night. Did you look through it? I glanced at my dresser where I'd placed it when I got home. Not yet. I was too tired. Take a look when you get a chance. There's information in there about the foundation, what we do, how we operate. But there's also something else. A letter specifically for you. A letter. From me. An offer, actually. Not one you have to accept, and not one I need an answer on right away. But I think you should know it exists. My curiosity was immediate and overwhelming. Can you tell me what it's about? I'd rather you read it first. Give it some thought. Then call me back if you want to discuss it. His voice softened. You impressed me last night, Natalie. Not just because you stood up, but because you didn't do it for yourself. That kind of character is rare. I'd like to talk about what that could mean going forward. We said goodbye, and I ended the call feeling more confused than before. I walked to the dresser and picked up the folder, feeling its weight again. It was thick, maybe 30 pages of documents. I carried it to the small kitchen table and sat down, opening it slowly. The first section was professional. Glossy pamphlets about the Garrett Foundation, its mission statement, statistics about how many veterans it had helped over the years, testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by their programs. Housing assistance. Job training. Mental health support. Educational scholarships for children of fallen service members. The scope was staggering. Then came the financial documents. Transparent breakdowns of where funding came from and where it went. Salaries, program costs, overhead. Everything laid out clearly, honestly. I understood why the Colonel had pulled funding from Veronica's event. This foundation didn't waste money on optics or appearances. Every dollar went exactly where it was supposed to go. Near the back of the folder, I found the letter. It was handwritten on simple stationery, the ink slightly smudged in places like it had been written quickly. The handwriting was neat but showed the slight tremor of age. "Dear Natalie," it began. "By the time you read this, you'll know what happened at the gala. You'll know that I pulled funding and caused what some people will call a scene. You might be questioning whether you did the right thing. Let me be clear, you did." I kept reading, my throat tightening. "I've spent 40 years running this foundation, and in that time I've met thousands of people who claim to care about veterans. Most of them do, in their own way. But caring isn't the same as acting. Caring isn't the same as sacrifice. You sacrificed your comfort, your family relationships, and you're standing in that room for someone you'd never met. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." The letter went on to describe the foundation's current structure. How the colonel was getting older, how he needed people he could trust to help carry the mission forward. How he'd been searching for someone who understood that this work wasn't about glory or recognition, but about service. "I'm offering you a position," the letter continued. "Director of Community Outreach for the Garrett Foundation. The role would involve working directly with veteran communities, identifying needs, building programs, and ensuring that the people we serve are treated with dignity. It's not glamorous work. It doesn't pay as much as corporate positions. But it matters. And I think you're someone who cares about things that matter." I read the paragraph 3 times, making sure I understood it correctly. He was offering me a job. A real job, not just a token gesture or a thank you for what happened. A position with responsibility and purpose. The letter concluded with practical details. The salary, which was actually more than I made as a teacher. The location, San Diego, where the foundation was headquartered. The benefits, the expectations, the timeline. And then, at the very end, a handwritten note that looked like it had been added after the rest. "Grace would have liked you. She always said the best people are the ones who can't walk past injustice without doing something about it. Even when it costs them. Especially then. Think about it. Take your time. But know that this offer is genuine, and it stands regardless of what happens with the media circus. You've already proven yourself. Now it's just a question of what you want to do with that. With respect and hope, Henry Garrett." I set the letter down and stared at it. Director of Community Outreach. A job that would mean leaving Charlotte, leaving my apartment and my students and the life I'd built here. Leaving my family, though that felt less like a loss and more like an inevitability at this point. Moving across the country to work for a foundation I'd only learned about 24 hours ago. It should have felt overwhelming. It should have felt impossible. But instead, it felt like something clicking into place. Like a door opening that I hadn't known I'd been searching for. My phone buzzed again. Another news request. I ignored it and instead opened my laptop, searching for more information about the Garrett Foundation. Reviews from veterans who'd used their services. Articles about their programs. Interviews with Colonel Garrett from years past. Everything I found confirmed what the folder had told me. This was legitimate. This was real. This mattered. I spent the rest of the day reading, researching, thinking. By evening, the video from the gala had been viewed over 5 million times. News outlets were running stories with headlines like "Teacher Defends War Hero, Gets Ejected from Charity Event and Veteran Pulls Funding After Gala Humiliation." My name was in some of them. My face in others. People were picking apart every detail, debating whether I'd been right or wrong, whether the colonel had overreacted, whether Veronica had committed some kind of crime. None of that felt important anymore. What felt important was the letter on my kitchen table and the choice it represented. Stay here, keep teaching, keep my head down and wait for this to blow over. Or take a leap into something unknown, something that might actually change lives. I picked up my phone and dialed the colonel's number again. He answered almost immediately. "I read the letter," I said. "And I have questions. I'd be worried if you didn't." We talked for over an hour. He answered every question I had about the position, the foundation, the work itself. He told me about the team I'd be working with, the projects currently in development, the challenges they were facing. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He made it clear this would be hard work, often frustrating, sometimes heartbreaking. But it's also the most important work I've ever done, he said. More important than anything I did in uniform. Because this is about making sure that what we ask people to sacrifice actually means something when they come home. When we finally ended the call, I sat in my darkening apartment and thought about Grace Garrett. A medic who'd died trying to save others. Someone who couldn't walk past suffering without acting. Someone whose father had turned his grief into a mission that had helped thousands of people over 4 decades. I thought about my students, the ones who'd be starting a unit on World War II next month. How I'd teach them about sacrifice and service and the cost of freedom. How I'd tell them it mattered, that what those soldiers did meant something. And I thought about how empty those words would feel if I didn't believe them enough to act on them myself. My phone buzzed one more time. A text from Veronica. We need to talk about repairing the damage you've caused. Call me. I deleted it without responding. Then I opened my email and started typing. Dear Principal Morrison, I'm writing to inform you that I'll be resigning from my teaching position effective at the end of this semester. This was not an easy decision, but I've been offered an opportunity that I believe will allow me to serve a cause greater than myself. I kept writing, explaining without oversharing, thanking him for the opportunity to teach, offering to help find and train my replacement. When I finished, I read it through twice, then hit send before I could second-guess myself. The apartment felt different after that. Lighter somehow. Like I'd been carrying something heavy without realizing it and had finally set it down. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights, at Charlotte spread out below me in the autumn darkness. I'd lived here for 5 years. Built a routine, made a few friends, carved out a small comfortable existence. But comfortable wasn't the same as meaningful. And I was tired of choosing comfort over truth. I texted Sergeant Ortega, asking for the colonel's email address. When he sent it, I drafted a message accepting the position, pending the formal offer letter and details. I wrote that I'd need time to wrap up my current obligations, find someone to take over my lease, pack up my life. But that I was ready. That I wanted to do this. I hit send and felt my heart rate spike immediately. This was real now. I just agreed to upend my entire life based on one night, one act of standing up, one letter from a man I barely knew. But I trusted him. More than that, I trusted what I'd seen in his eyes when he talked about his daughter, about the veterans his foundation served, about the work that needed to be done. That kind of conviction couldn't be faked. That kind of purpose was worth following. My phone rang. The colonel. I answered. Got your email, he said. Welcome to the team, Natalie. Thank you for the opportunity. No, he said quietly. Thank you for reminding me why this work matters. We'll talk logistics tomorrow. Tonight, just rest. You've had a hell of a couple days. After we hung up, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the city and thinking about what came next. Somewhere out there, people were still arguing about the video, about what I'd done, about whether it had been right or reckless. My family was probably plotting how to manage the fallout, how to spin this into something less damaging to their reputation. But none of that touched me anymore. I'd made my choice. Not to fight them, but to walk away from them entirely. To follow something that felt true and important and worth the risk. I pulled the Purple Heart replica from my purse where I'd been carrying it and hung it on the wall above my desk, next to a photo of my mother from before she got sick. She looked young in that picture, vibrant, full of the kind of quiet strength I'd always tried to emulate. I wondered what she'd think about what I was doing. Whether she'd be proud or worried or both. I decided she'd understand. She'd always told me that the hardest choices were usually the right ones. That doing what mattered often meant giving up what was easy. Looking at her picture and the medal hanging beside it, I felt like I was finally learning what she meant. Tomorrow would bring more chaos. More calls, more decisions, more people wanting pieces of the story. But tonight, in the quiet of my apartment with a new path spreading out before me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real hope. The kind that comes from knowing you're moving toward something that matters rather than away from something that doesn't. I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table with the folder spread out in front of me, beginning to read through the Foundation's current programs in detail. There was so much to learn. So much to understand. But I had time. And more than that, I had purpose. Outside, the city kept moving, indifferent to the small shifts happening in one apartment, in one life. But those shifts felt enormous to me. Like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, ready to jump. I looked at the letter one more time, at Colonel Garrett's handwriting, at Grace's name mentioned with such quiet pride. I thought about legacy, about what we leave behind, about the difference between existing and actually living. Then I closed the folder, turned off the lights, and went to bed knowing that when I woke up tomorrow, everything would be different. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt exactly right. 3 months later, I stood in the main conference room of the Garrett Foundation headquarters in San Diego, looking out at the Pacific Ocean through floor-to-ceiling windows. The building itself was modest compared to the corporate towers I'd seen in other cities, just 4 stories of clean lines and practical design. But the location was stunning. Perched on a hillside overlooking the water, close enough to the naval base that you could sometimes hear the sounds of drills and ceremonies carrying on the wind. The move had been harder than I'd expected. Not logistically, Sergeant Ortega had helped coordinate everything with military precision, but emotionally. Leaving Charlotte meant leaving the last threads connecting me to my old life. My students had thrown me a surprise goodbye party, filling my classroom with handmade cards that I'd packed carefully in a box I still couldn't bring myself to open. A few colleagues had taken me out for drinks, asking questions about my new job that I'd answered vaguely, still not quite believing it was real. My father had called once, the week before I left. The conversation had been stilted, full of long pauses and careful words. He'd asked if I was sure about this decision, if I'd thought it through, if I understood what I was giving up. I'd told him I understood perfectly, that I was giving up a life that had never quite fit for one that might actually matter. He'd gone quiet after that, and we'd said goodbye without any real resolution. Trevor hadn't called at all. Neither had Veronica. The apartment in San Diego was smaller than my place in Charlotte but brighter, with actual sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked a courtyard with palm trees. I'd furnished it slowly, mostly with second-hand pieces that reminded me of my mother's aesthetic. Simple, functional, chosen with care rather than expense. The Purple Heart replica hung by my bed now, catching the morning light when I woke up. My first weeks at the Foundation had been overwhelming in the best possible way. Colonel Garrett had introduced me to the team, a collection of people who ranged from retired military officers to social workers to former veterans who'd come through the Foundation's programs and stayed to help others. Everyone had a story. Everyone had a reason for being there that went beyond a paycheck. Marcus Webb, not the hotel coordinator but a different Marcus who'd served in Iraq, ran the housing program. He'd been homeless himself for 2 years after his discharge, sleeping in his car and struggling with injuries that made steady work impossible. The Foundation had given him an apartment, helped him get treatment, trained him for a new career. Now he made sure other veterans didn't fall through the same cracks he had. Elena Rodriguez managed the mental health services, coordinating with therapists and counselors who specialized in PTSD and traumatic brain injuries. She was a Navy veteran herself, soft-spoken but fiercely protective of the people under her care. She'd lost her brother to suicide 3 years after he came home from Afghanistan, and she'd made it her mission to ensure no other family went through what hers had. Then there was James Kirkland, a former Marine who oversaw job training and placement. He was built like a tank, with a deep voice and a surprisingly gentle demeanor. He spent his days connecting veterans with employers, teaching interview skills, helping people translate military experience into civilian resumes. He told me once that finding work had saved his life after he got out, that having purpose was the difference between surviving and actually living. These were the people I worked with now. People who understood sacrifice not as an abstract concept but as a lived reality. Being around them felt different from anything I'd experienced in my teaching career. There was no pretense here, no performance. Just honest work done by people who cared deeply about the outcome. My role as Director of Community Outreach meant building bridges between the Foundation and the veterans who needed help. It meant going to VA hospitals and community centers, talking to people who'd been let down by systems that were supposed to support them, finding ways to connect them with resources. It meant listening to stories that broke my heart and then figuring out how to actually help rather than just offering sympathy. Colonel Garrett worked from the office most days, though his schedule had slowed considerably since I'd arrived. He'd told me privately that part of why he'd hired me was to start transitioning leadership to people who could carry the mission forward when he couldn't anymore. He was 76, and while his mind was sharp, his body was showing the wear of age and old injuries. Some days his hands shook too much to type. Other days the walk from the parking lot to the building took twice as long as it should have. But he still came in. Still reviewed every major decision. Still insisted on meeting the veterans we served, learning their names, understanding their circumstances. He treated each person like they mattered individually, not just as a number in our statistics. That approach shaped everything the foundation did. On this particular morning, I was preparing for something that had my stomach in knots. A presentation to potential donors, people with the kind of wealth that could fund entire programs if we convinced them the cause was worth their investment. Colonel Garrett would be there, along with Elena and Marcus, but I was leading the pitch. My first major test in this role. The conference room was set up with chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a screen where I'd project information about our programs. Coffee and pastries sat on a side table, catered by a local veteran-owned bakery we'd partnered with. Everything looked professional, polished, ready. Sergeant Ortega appeared in the doorway. "They're here." 5 minutes out. I nodded, checking my notes one more time. I'd prepared obsessively for this, rehearsing my talking points until I could recite them in my sleep. But knowing the information and delivering it persuasively to people who could choose to invest or walk away were two different things entirely. Colonel Garrett entered the room, moving slowly with his cane. He'd dressed formally today, his suit pressed and his posture as straight as his aging spine would allow. He settled into a chair near the back and gave me a small nod of encouragement. Elena and Marcus filed in next, taking seats on either side of the room. Then the donors arrived, escorted by Sergeant Ortega. 3 people. A man in his 60s wearing a polo shirt and expensive watch, introduced as Richard Holloway, founder of a tech company I'd heard of. A woman maybe 10 years younger in a cream-colored blazer, Catherine Mendez, who'd made her fortune in real estate. And a younger man, probably early 40s, named David Chen, who'd sold a startup and was apparently looking for meaningful ways to invest his windfall. I shook hands with each of them, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. They settled into their chairs, accepted coffee from Sergeant Ortega, and turned their attention to me with expressions of polite interest. I began the presentation, starting with the Foundation's history. How Colonel Garrett had built it from nothing 4 decades ago. How it had grown from helping a handful of veterans to serving thousands every year. How every program had been designed based on actual need rather than assumptions about what veterans required. I showed them statistics. Housing placements. Employment rates. Mental health outcomes. The numbers were strong, carefully tracked and verified by independent auditors. We had nothing to hide because we'd built everything on transparency and accountability. But numbers alone wouldn't move people. I knew that. So I shifted to stories, real stories from real people who'd given us permission to share their experiences. Marcus spoke about his own journey from homelessness to running our housing program. Elena described working with a young veteran who'd been on the verge of suicide and was now 2 years into recovery, employed and rebuilding relationships with his family. I talked about a woman I'd met at a VA hospital the week before, someone who'd served in the army for 8 years and come home to nothing. No job prospects. No housing. No support system. She'd been sleeping in her car when someone told her about our foundation. Within a month, we'd helped her find an apartment and connected her with an employer looking for people with her logistics experience. She'd sent me a text message 2 days ago saying she'd received her first paycheck and cried in the grocery store because she could actually afford to buy food. Richard Holloway leaned forward. These outcomes are impressive. But I've seen a lot of veteran organizations make big promises and deliver minimal results. What makes your foundation different? Colonel Garrett spoke before I could answer. We were built by veterans, for veterans. Not by people who think they know what we need, but by people who've lived it. Every person who works here has either served or lost someone who served. We don't do this for tax breaks or good publicity. We do it because we know what happens when people come home and find that nobody actually cares beyond the yellow ribbon bumper stickers. His voice was quiet but carried weight that filled the room. Richard nodded slowly, processing that. Catherine Mendez asked about financial sustainability. How do you fund operations long term? What happens if major donors pull out? I walked them through our funding model. Individual donations made up about 40% of our budget. Corporate grants another 30%. Government contracts for specific services covered 20%. The final 10% came from the Colonel's personal wealth, though we were actively working to reduce that dependency. We've diversified intentionally, I explained. After what happened in Asheville, we learned that relying too heavily on any single source makes us vulnerable. We're building a broader base of support so that no one donor or event can make or break our operations. David Chen, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. I saw the video from that gala. That's actually why I agreed to this meeting. I wanted to see if the foundation was as legitimate as the Colonel's speech made it sound. I met his gaze directly. And what's your assessment? He smiled slightly. I think you're the real deal. But I need to understand something. That incident cost you a major funding source. It got you national attention, sure, but it also made you enemies. People who might have donated before probably won't now because they don't want to be associated with controversy. So why do it? Why blow up a lucrative relationship over a seating arrangement? The room went quiet. Everyone looked at Colonel Garrett, expecting him to answer. But he gestured to me. I thought about my answer carefully. Because the seating arrangement wasn't the point. The point was what it represented. A willingness to hide veterans when they're inconvenient. To value donor comfort over the dignity of the people we claim to serve. If we'd stayed silent about that, we'd be complicit in it. And that would make everything else we do feel hollow. I paused, making sure David was really listening. This foundation exists to tell veterans that their service mattered, that they matter. We can't do that authentically while participating in systems that treat them as second class. Sometimes standing up for your principles costs you money and relationships. But if you compromise those principles to keep the money, you've already lost what made you worth supporting in the first place. Catherine was nodding. Richard was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. David leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed but his face thoughtful. Colonel Garrett added, "We lost that funding, yes. But we gained something more valuable. Credibility. Veterans know now that we mean what we say. That we'll fight for them even when it's expensive. You can't buy that kind of trust." The presentation continued for another 30 minutes. We showed them our facilities, introduced them to staff members, answered technical questions about program implementation and outcome tracking. They were thorough, asking about everything from our governance structure to our plans for expansion. When it ended, they thanked us and said they'd be in touch. Standard procedure. No commitments, no promises. Just polite interest and a handshake. After they left, I slumped into a chair, exhausted. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder. "You did great. Really great." Elena agreed. "That answer about principles versus funding? Perfect." Colonel Garrett remained in his seat, quiet. When the others had filtered out, he spoke. "You handled that well. Better than I expected for your first major pitch. Do you think they'll donate?" He shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. But that's not entirely the point. You represented this foundation honestly. You didn't promise things we can't deliver. You didn't soften our stance to make them more comfortable. That matters more than whether they write a check." I appreciated his perspective, but I also knew we needed funding to keep operating. Good intentions didn't pay staff salaries or cover housing deposits for homeless veterans. Over the next week, I threw myself into other work. I visited 3 different VA facilities, met with dozens of veterans, collected information about needs we weren't currently addressing. I worked with Marcus to streamline our housing application process. I helped Elena organize a training session for new volunteer counselors. I reviewed budget reports and grant applications until my eyes burned. Then, 9 days after the presentation, I received an email. From David Chen. Subject line, Partnership Opportunity. I opened it with my heart pounding. He wrote that he'd been impressed by what he'd seen at the foundation. That after doing additional research and speaking with veterans who'd used our services, he'd decided to make a donation. Not a small one. $500,000, unrestricted funding to be used however we saw fit. Additionally, he wanted to discuss establishing a permanent endowment that would provide stable annual income. I read the email 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. Then I walked straight to Colonel Garrett's office and knocked. He was at his desk, reading something on his computer through glasses perched on his nose. "Come in." I showed him the email. He read it slowly, his expression unchanging. When he finished, he looked up at me. "This is significant." "It's incredible," I said. "It could fund an entire new program or expand existing ones, or it could provide the stability we've been building toward," he finished. Unrestricted funds are rare. Most donors want their names on specific programs. This gives us flexibility. He stood up slowly and walked to the window overlooking the ocean. "You know what this means, don't you?" I wasn't sure what he was getting at. "It means your instinct was right. Standing on principle, even when it's costly, attracts the kind of support that actually matters." David Chen didn't donate because we gave him a polished presentation. He donated because he saw that we mean what we say. I joined him at the window. The water was deep blue today, sparkling in the afternoon sun. Somewhere out there, sailors were training. Marines were drilling. People were preparing to serve, not knowing what they'd face or how they'd be treated when they came home. "We should celebrate," I said. "Get the team together, share the news." Colonel Garrett nodded. "We will. But first, there's something I want to show you." He led me down the hall to a room I hadn't been in before. It was smaller than the main conference room, with a single large table and walls covered in photographs. Pictures of veterans who'd come through our programs. Some in uniform, young and strong. Others in civilian clothes, older, rebuilding their lives. Names and dates written in neat script beneath each image. "This is Grace's room," Colonel Garrett said quietly. "I started it after she died. Every person we help, I put their picture here. She wanted to be a doctor, did you know that? After her service. She wanted to come home and open a clinic for veterans who couldn't afford regular health care." He touched one of the photographs gently. A young woman in army fatigues, her smile bright and genuine. Lieutenant Grace Garrett. She never got to do that. But this room, this foundation, it's the closest I could come to honoring what she wanted. Every face on these walls represents someone who got a chance she didn't. Someone who made it home and found support waiting. I looked around at the dozens of photographs, the hundreds of stories they represented. "How many people are up here?" 4,372. "As of last week." He said it like he'd memorized the number, like he carried it with him everywhere. "And with David Chen's donation, we'll be able to add hundreds more." We stood there in silence for a long moment. Then Colonel Garrett turned to me. "I brought you here because I want you to understand something. This work we do, it's not about recognition or headlines or even about the funding, as important as that is. It's about these faces. These lives. Making sure that when someone comes home from serving their country, they don't end up forgotten or discarded or treated like they're invisible." He paused, his voice growing softer. "You did that at the gala. You refused to let me be invisible. And now you're doing it here, every day, for people who've been made to feel like they don't matter. That's why I hired you. Not because you made a scene or because a video went viral. But because you couldn't look away when something was wrong." I felt tears prickling at my eyes but kept them at bay. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for taking it." He gestured to the walls. "One day, when I'm gone, someone will run this foundation who never knew Grace. Never knew the men I served with. Never experienced firsthand what it means to come home from war. That's inevitable. But if that person has your character, your refusal to accept injustice, then this place will be fine. Better than fine. We walked back to his office together, and I helped him draft a response to David Chen's email. Professional, grateful, outlining how we'd use the funds responsibly and maximize their impact. When it was sent, Colonel Garrett leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression. "You know what the best part of this is?" he asked. "What?" "Veronica Brennan will eventually hear about it. She'll know that pulling her funding didn't destroy us. That we're still here, still growing, still doing the work. And she'll have to live with the fact that her cruelty accomplished nothing except exposing who she really is." I thought about that. About Veronica and Trevor and my father, still in North Carolina, still pretending that night at the gala had been a misunderstanding. Still telling themselves they'd done nothing wrong. "I don't think about them much anymore," I said honestly. "They feel like they belong to a different life." "Good," Colonel Garrett replied. "That's exactly how it should be. You can't move forward while looking backward." The rest of that day passed in a blur of activity. We told the team about the donation. People cheered, hugged, started immediately planning how to expand programs. Marcus wanted to add more housing units. Elena wanted to hire additional counselors. James wanted to develop a specialized program for female veterans, who often faced unique challenges in transitioning to civilian life. I took notes on all of it, my mind racing with possibilities. This was what I'd left Charlotte for. Not the drama or attention, but this. The chance to actually make a difference in ways that mattered, that lasted, that honored people who deserved so much more than they typically received. That evening, I drove home along the coastal highway as the sun set over the Pacific. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and purple, colors so vivid they almost didn't look real. I thought about the photographs in Grace's room. 4,372 people who'd been given a second chance. Who'd been told they mattered. Who'd found support when they needed it most. I thought about the Purple Heart replica hanging by my bed, given to me by a man who'd seen something in me I hadn't known was there. Who'd offered me a path I hadn't known I was looking for. And I thought about my mother, gone now for over a decade, who'd always told me that the best life was one lived in service to something greater than yourself. I finally understood what she meant. Not in an abstract way, but in the concrete reality of daily work that exhausted me and fulfilled me in equal measure. When I got home, I opened my laptop and started drafting ideas for the new programs we could implement with David Chen's donation. I worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and purpose, feeling more alive than I had in years. Outside my window, the palm trees swayed in the ocean breeze. The city lights twinkled like earthbound stars. And somewhere in San Diego, there were veterans who needed help, who deserved dignity, who would walk through our doors in the coming weeks and months and find people ready to fight for them. I was one of those people now. Not because a video had gone viral or because I'd made headlines. But because I'd chosen to be. Because when given the option between comfort and conviction, I'd picked conviction. And that choice had led me here, to work that mattered, with people who understood what service really meant. I saved my document and closed my laptop, satisfied with the progress. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new veterans to help, new problems to solve. But tonight, I let myself feel grateful. 4 second chances. 4 meaningful work. For the unexpected paths that open when you refuse to look away from injustice. The Purple Heart replica caught the moonlight coming through my window, glinting softly in the darkness. A reminder of where I'd been and where I was going. A symbol of courage, both the kind displayed in combat and the kind required to stand up when standing up costs you everything. I touched it gently, thinking of Grace, of Colonel Garrett, of all the veterans whose faces lined the walls of that memorial room. Then I turned off the lights and went to bed, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. Because this was my life now. Not perfect, but purposeful. Not easy, but essential. And absolutely, completely worth it. 2 years had passed since that night in Asheville, and the foundation had transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined. We'd opened satellite offices in 3 more cities. Our housing program had doubled in capacity. The mental health services now included specialized trauma therapy that was getting attention from researchers nationwide. And Grace's memorial room had run out of wall space, forcing us to expand into an adjacent area to accommodate all the new photographs. Colonel Garrett had slowed down considerably. He came into the office less frequently now, working mostly from home with Sergeant Ortega helping him manage communications. His hands trembled more. His steps were slower. But his mind remained sharp, and he still reviewed major decisions, still insisted on hearing about the veterans we were helping, still carried the mission forward with quiet determination. On a bright morning in May, I received a call from Sergeant Ortega. His voice was calm but serious. "Natalie, you should come to the Colonel's house. He asked for you specifically." I drove to his home in La Jolla, a modest place overlooking the ocean despite his wealth. He could have afforded a mansion, but he'd chosen simplicity instead, putting his resources into the foundation rather than personal luxury. Sergeant Ortega met me at the door and led me to the study where Colonel Garrett sat in a leather chair by the window, sunlight streaming across his face. He looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, but his eyes still held that same clarity. "Natalie, thank you for coming." "Of course. Is everything all right?" He smiled faintly. "As all right as it can be at 78 with a body that's finally admitting defeat. Sit down. We need to talk about the future." I settled into the chair across from him, my stomach tightening with concern. "I'm stepping down as director of the foundation," he said without preamble. "Officially, as of next month. The board has already been informed. They've voted unanimously on my recommendation for who should take over." I waited, assuming he'd hired someone with decades of non-profit experience, someone who'd built organizations from the ground up. "They chose you," he said quietly. "If you'll accept it." The words didn't register at first. When they did, I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. "Me? Colonel, I've only been here 2 years. There are people on staff who've been doing this work for decades. And every one of them supported the decision. You've earned their respect, Natalie. More importantly, you understand what this work is really about. Not procedures or fundraising strategies, though you've mastered those too. You understand that we're here to restore dignity. To tell people they matter. That's not something you can teach." He reached for a folder on the side table, his hands shaking slightly. "Grace's college essays are in here. I was reading them this morning. In one of them, she wrote about what kind of doctor she wanted to be. She said the best healers aren't the ones with the most technical skill, they're the ones who see patients as whole people, who refuse to reduce suffering to symptoms." His voice caught slightly. "That's what you do. You see the whole person. The veteran who needs housing isn't just a case file to you. They're someone with a story, with value, with potential. That's why you should lead this foundation. Because you'll never forget that." I felt tears building but held them back. What if I'm not ready? Nobody's ever ready for the things that matter most. But you'll rise to it. You already have. He handed me the folder. "These essays, my letters to the board recommending you, the updated organizational documents naming you as director, it's all here. Take your time reviewing it. The transition won't be immediate. We'll do it properly." Over the following weeks, I worked closely with Colonel Garrett and the board to prepare for the leadership change. Staff meetings where responsibilities were redistributed. Strategic planning sessions for the next 5 years. Media coordination for the announcement. Every detail handled with care. The official ceremony happened on a June afternoon at our headquarters. Veterans we'd helped over the years attended, along with staff, board members, donors, and local officials. Colonel Garrett gave a short speech about building something that would outlast him, about the importance of passing the torch to people who would honor the mission. When he called me to the podium, the applause was genuine and warm. I looked out at the crowd and saw faces I'd come to know well. Marcus, who'd taught me how to navigate bureaucracy to get veterans housed quickly. Elena, who'd shown me how to listen to trauma without trying to fix it with empty platitudes. James, who'd demonstrated that tough love and genuine compassion weren't contradictory. I kept my remarks brief. I thanked Colonel Garrett for his trust. I promised to honor Grace's memory by ensuring every veteran who came through our doors was treated with the dignity they'd earned. I acknowledged that I had enormous shoes to fill and that I'd need everyone's help to do this work well. After the ceremony, people lingered, sharing stories and memories. A veteran I'd helped find housing a year ago approached me with his young daughter. "I wanted her to meet you," he said. "So she knows that good people exist. That someone cared enough to help when we had nothing." His daughter looked up at me with wide eyes. "Thank you for helping my daddy." I knelt down to her level. "Your daddy's a hero. I'm just glad I could help him." As the sun set and people began to leave, I found Colonel Garrett sitting alone in Grace's memorial room, looking at the photographs that now covered 2 full walls. I sat beside him quietly. "She'd be proud of you," I said. "She'd be proud of this," he corrected, gesturing to the walls. "All these lives changed. All these people given a second chance. That's what she wanted. That's what mattered to her." We sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the faces of people who'd been told they mattered when the world had tried to convince them otherwise. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked. "That night at the gala. The scene, the funding loss, everything that came after." He shook his head. "Best decision I ever made. Because it brought you here. And now this place will continue long after I'm gone, in hands I trust completely." 6 months later, Colonel Henry Garrett passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was held at a military cemetery overlooking the ocean. Hundreds of people attended, veterans whose lives he'd changed, staff who'd worked alongside him, family members of people he'd helped. I gave a eulogy, though my voice shook throughout. I told them about a man who'd turned grief into purpose. Who'd spent 40 years proving that service didn't end when you took off the uniform. Who'd taught me that standing up for what's right might cost you everything but was always worth it. We buried him with full military honors, not far from where Grace was laid to rest. After everyone had left, I stood at his grave with the Purple Heart replica he'd given me that night in Asheville. I'd carried it every day since, a reminder of where this journey started. "Thank you," I whispered. "For seeing something in me I didn't know was there. For giving me a chance to do work that matters. For everything." The foundation continued, stronger than ever. David Chen's endowment provided stability. New donors emerged, inspired by our commitment to principles over profit. We expanded programs, helped more veterans, added more photographs to Grace's memorial walls. And every time I walked into the office, I passed a new plaque we'd installed by the entrance. It read, "In memory of Colonel Henry Garrett and Lieutenant Grace Garrett. They taught us that true service never ends, and that dignity is not negotiable." I'd learned that lesson well. Not from a classroom or a textbook, but from a night when I couldn't stay silent, from a man who rewarded courage instead of punishing it, from work that exhausted me and fulfilled me in equal measure. Sometimes people asked me if I missed teaching. I told them I never stopped. I just found students who needed different lessons, about worth and dignity and second chances. About how one person standing up could change everything. The video from that night still existed online, still got shared occasionally. But it didn't define me anymore. What defined me was the work. The veterans whose lives we changed. The legacy I'd been entrusted to carry forward. I'd made headlines that night in Asheville. But what mattered more was what came after, the quiet daily work of proving that dignity wasn't just a word, but a practice. A promise. A foundation built to last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out,